Hi friends, Jenny at Clover and Violet here, and today I'm going to be unraveling what the difference is between single fold, double fold, bias tape, and binding. Those terms can be really confusing, and when you're finishing your project, at the very end, you want to make sure that you get the right kind of finishing for it, whether that be binding, bias tape, and what you need and what the differences are between them. So whether you're heading to your big box store and you want to buy a pre-finished binding or bias tape, or you want to make your very own binding or bias tape to perfectly match your project, but you don't know what exactly you're looking to finish. So let's head over to the cutting table, look at these different single fold, double fold, bias tape, and binding, and see what the difference is, how we use each one, and hopefully this will clear up some confusion for you as you tackle your next project. Okay, before me, I have a variety of bindings and bias tapes, and there's a lot of confusion. I know I face a lot of confusion about single fold, double fold, bias tape, binding. What do those terms mean? So let's hope that I can clear that up for you. I have these homemade bias tapes and bindings right here, and then I went to my local Joann Fabrics and I picked out all of the different options that they had for double fold bias tape extra wide. This is also double fold bias tape. This one says quilt binding. This one says single fold. So we're going to open all of these up and check them out. But first, let me talk to you about these homemade bias tapes and bindings I have here. So these two right here are both just regular binding. Okay, I have cut these on the straight of the grain. So that means I just took my piece of fabric and cut from salvage to salvage straight across. This is bias tape. It has been cut on a 45-degree angle, and this is what you're going to need bias tape to go around the curve of anything. So if you are sewing a project with a curve, like the Rosa supply case, you see it has a nice curve here. Cutting on the 45-degree angle for the bias is what's going to allow you to go around this curve. Now, when I say cut or fold, as for bias tape, what I'm saying is you're going to fold your piece like this, right? So the bias tape is folded in the middle, and then these two sides are folded in, and then it's folded again. Okay, so if you see in my patterns, fold as for bias tape, that's the style of fold you're going to make. You can make that style of fold with any piece of fabric. That's just this style of fold. Fold it in half, then open it, then fold those two sides in, and then fold it again. That's folding as for bias tape. But the actual bias portion is that it's cut on a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to link my bias tape, how to make your own bias tape video in the description of this video. But, so that's what bias tape is. It can go around the curve because it's cut on the 45-degree angle, and it can stretch. See how this can curve, right? This one, no curve. This, curve. And honestly, the thing about bias tape is you have to be really careful not to accidentally stretch it out. Okay, now let's talk about these two bindings I have here. This binding is cut at 2.5 inches, and it's pressed and folded in half. Now, when you apply this piece of binding to a quilt, I'm just going to grab a piece of fabric and we're going to pretend this is a quilt. You're going to sew it with the raw edge to the edge. Here's your folded edge, and then it's going to fold around and around. And I have a video on how to apply this kind of binding. Quilt binding, it can also be used for projects. But since it's cut on straight of the grain, your project needs to have a corner for it to go around. This is not going to ease around a rounded corner like on a floral supply case. So here's your binding. I call this double fold binding because it's folded once, and then you're going to fold it around and around. So you have this folded edge right here. I don't know if that's really the traditional name for it, but that's how I distinguish it from what I call single fold binding. So this binding is 1 inch, and I have a video also on how to use single fold binding on your quilt. And you're going to sew this to the edge of your quilt completely flat, and then fold it around, turn your project over, fold it here, and fold it down. And so it's going to sew on much like as if it were bias tape in the same folding manner, but we're just going to apply it to our quilt flat. So in the description of this video, I also have directions on how I do single fold binding. So these are the 3 types of homemade bindings you'll find in my patterns, in my tutorials, and that sort of thing. So if you're using homemade bindings, we have bias tape, single fold binding, and then quilt binding, or I'll sometimes call this double fold binding. Let's set these aside. And now we're going to look at these store-bought bindings. So all of these say bias tape on them because they're all cut on the 45-degree angle like bias tape, right? But they have a variety of different names on them. See this one, you can see it says extra wide, but it's not as wide as this quilt binding bias tape. So let's just open these up. Let's open the quilt binding double fold bias tape first. If I can get it out of the package. Okay, so this is your quilt binding double fold bias tape. And here we have it. It is cut on the bias. It's folded just like I would say bias tape is folded, with that fold in the center and then the 2 sides going out. But this piece is actually 3.5 inches wide, just about. So 1, 2, 3.5 inches wide. So that's going to be a really wide quilt binding. And then you would just sew this onto your quilt just like you would any other bias tape. You would probably just slide your quilt in here and then sew along it. One thing to note is that bias tape often has one slightly shorter side and one longer. So if you pay attention to which is the shorter side and then stitch on the along it, you'll make sure to get both sides in your stitching. So there's our quilt binding bias tape. Now let's compare it to our extra wide bias tape. Let's open this one up. Okay, so here's our extra wide bias tape. Again, this is kind of misfolded in the package, but again, you can see it's folded just like our other bias tape, so folded in half and then the long sides in towards the middle. And you can see that this one is bias tape, extra wide, double fold. So pretty self-explanatory. This says it's a 1/2 inch wide. And so the 1/2 inch they mean is the finished width of the bias tape. You're not cutting a 1/2 inch here. This piece is actually in total almost 2 inches wide. And then it's just folded and folded, and you can see it's cut on the bias. It has that stretch. Okay, so there's your double fold bias tape. Now let's open the single fold bias tape next. So this is also 1/2 inch wide. So you're facing these 2 products, 1/2 inch double fold and 1/2 inch single fold. So let's look again at the difference. Okay, this bias tape, this single fold, is not folded in the middle. Can you see this? It has 2 folds and it lacks that middle fold. This kind of bias tape is often used for applique or something like that, where the bias tape is going to be sewn on top of your project. So this double fold bias tape is going to be used as an edging, most likely, whereas this single fold bias tape is going to be sewn right on top of your project, and the raw edges are right here. They are not hidden on the back. This, all the raw edges are inside this bias tape. So that's your difference for your single fold bias tape. So here we have single fold, which interestingly has 2 folds, and then double fold, which has 3. But this one is missing that last center fold. Now let's open our last package. This again is double fold bias tape, but it is not extra wide. And so here we have, again, our bias tape has an extra fold in the middle. And you'll notice that this bias tape unfolded is the same size as our single fold bias tape. So these 2 bias tapes right here are actually the same size fabric strip, but this one is folded 1 extra time. It's double fold bias tape. This one is folded only the 1 time, or 2 long edges folded in. And so it is single fold bias tape. So there you have the difference. Quilt binding for these purchased bindings, the Wrights, is much wider, but still cut on the bias and still folded like bias tape. This is the package for the quilt binding. Double fold bias tape quilt binding. So nice and wide. Then we have our extra wide double fold bias tape. This is about standard for what I make for my own homemade bias tape. You can see these are about the same size. And I use this Clover number 25 bias tape maker, and we cut this fabric at 1 7/8 inch, so just not quite 2 inch, and it makes the bias tape about the same size as this 1/2 inch wide double fold bias tape. And again, this is in my video on how to make your own bias tape. So that would be the same as buying this double fold extra wide bias tape. Then again, we have single fold, which has just the 1 fold, and then this regular double fold bias tape, which is very narrow. And these 2 fabrics again are cut the same size. And then lastly, as a quick recap, here's our binding. That's our homemade binding. This is going to be cut on the straight of the grain. We're going to use this regular quilt binding, which is 2.5 inches folded in half and then sewn to your quilt folded. Sometimes I call this double fold binding, which is not the same thing as double fold bias tape. I just mean it's going to be folded double on your quilt. And then this single fold binding that I use for mini quilts and small projects like mug rugs, it is going to be sewn onto your quilt completely flat and then wrapped around. Very much the same style of bias tape, but we're going to sew it on first and then wrap and fold it. And I have a link for that tutorial in the description of this video as well. So I hope this helps you to clear up a little bit on what are these different kinds of binding and bias tape, and what can I use from the store to substitute for homemade bias tape or binding, because I know we all love the homemade, but sometimes you're just in a pinch or you just can't find the fabric you want and you just want to run to your big box quilt store and pick something up. So this should help clarify what exactly it is you're buying. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps you with your binding and bias tape purchases, and I look forward to seeing you again. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more helpful videos just like this one.